Ah, my friends, I know you better than you think, and I love you better too. The day after never, we shall have an explanation. Hi, I'm Tammy Rose. That was written by Henry David Thoreau. And this is Concord Conversations. I have with me Richard Smith, and we're here to discuss Henry David Thoreau in love.
Good afternoon. How are you, Tammy?
Good, good. How are you, Richard?
I'm doing very well. So this is an interesting topic because when it comes to the love life of people who lived 150 years ago, it's kind of like going down a rabbit hole for some of these people. For instance, Ralph Waldo Emerson, we know 4 things about his love life because he had 4 kids. We know 3 things about Nathaniel Hawthorne's love life because he had 3 kids. Henry Thoreau did not have children, never got married, lived with his mom and dad his whole life. So a lot of us in the 21st century have been wondering for many, many years what exactly was up with Henry and his love life.
Yeah, and it's really funny because we don't have a lot of documentation. I think we know a couple of instances, and we're going to talk about them today, about there were definitely 2 marriage proposals that happened in his life, and there was a lot of mention of love. I was trying to look up how many instances of love in the Walden catalog that's online, and it just goes on for pages. And a lot of the things he wrote about that he loved were about nature. Right. But then he also had a lot of quotes about people, and the way that people expressed love in the 1800s was different than how we really understand it, or at least the way they expressed it in letters and writings that we have.
Right. I think when it comes to anybody from the mid-19th century or from any period, to tell you the truth, there needs to be a lot of reading between the lines. When it comes to relationships, unless they are out and out saying sensual, romantic, loving things like somebody like Walt Whitman, it's hard for us to gauge exactly what a person's sexuality was all about. And in the 19th century, romantic love and sexual love, much to most people's surprise nowadays, would discover that it was pretty fluid for a lot of people. And so when it comes to Henry, we need to do a lot of reading between the lines. As you mentioned, there were 2 proposals, one from Thoreau, one to Thoreau. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the one and only time that he proposed, if that's okay with you.
Yes, absolutely. It's a great story.
Okay, so Henry was about 21, 22 years old. He had just graduated from Harvard College in 1837, was living in Concord, his hometown. He had an older brother named John Jr., and a young lady came to Concord named Ellen Sewell, and she was there for the summer. And all of the boys in Concord, from what I can gather, had quite the crush on her. She was from the South Shore, very intelligent, very beautiful, and all the boys in Concord had a big crush on her. She ended up spending a lot of time with both John Thoreau and his younger brother, Henry. So much so that they both were quite infatuated with her. In fact, only a few days after he met Ellen, Henry Thoreau wrote in his journal, "The only remedy for love is to love more." He's about 21 or 22 years old. Yes, so romantic. John was the older, and so I think that Henry kind of let his brother take the lead on this relationship. And from what we gather, both of the boys fell in love with Ellen. They both spent a lot of time with her, boating on the Concord River. A menagerie came to Concord when she was in town, and Henry took her to see the giraffe and things like that. Eventually, she left Concord, went back home to the South Shore of Massachusetts. For those who are not in Massachusetts, the South Shore, which is basically Hingham and Hall and Cohasset and all those places, Plymouth, that's the South Shore. John went down to visit her and proposed, and came back and announced that, yes, indeed, Ellen had accepted his marriage proposal. A short time later, he received a letter from Ellen saying that she could not marry him. And so Henry, being the good younger brother that he was, now that John was out of the way, he sat down and he wrote a letter to Ellen asking if she would marry him. And it didn't work out for Henry either. Ellen sent a letter to Henry saying that she could not marry him. In fact, in later life, she said it was one of the hardest letters she ever had to write. And it seems that her father, who was a Unitarian minister, was the one that put the kibosh on both of the marriage proposals. He thinking that the Thoreau boys were probably a little too transcendental for his daughter. Also, they were both schoolmasters, not really a great occupation in the mid-19th century. And so Ellen turned down both Henry and John.
Well, and Henry was fired from being a schoolmaster as well. So
he was. So here's a kid that really has no job proposals, has really nothing on the horizon where he's going to make any money. He's hanging out with people like Emerson and Bronson Alcott in Concord, Massachusetts. So naturally, I would think a minister father would be quite stunned and shocked and apoplectic that his young daughter is hanging out with these people. And so she says no. Not too long later, the exact date escapes me, Ellen did marry a man named Osgood, who was a Unitarian minister, and remained married to him for the rest of her life. They lived in Cohasset, Massachusetts. Henry Thoreau did stay friends with her and visited the family, the Osgoods, on a couple of occasions when he was down in Cohasset. Supposedly later in life, on his deathbed, somebody mentioned Ellen, and he said, quote, "I have always loved her." So that may or may not have been the great love of Henry's life. At the ripe age of 21 or 22, as far as we know, that was his only love affair.
Yeah. And how did how do you think that affected his attitude for the rest of his life? Well, was he on the prowl for women, or was he?
No, I think most of us, once we're rejected in love, we think, well, I'll just go find somebody else. Henry was not that way. In fact, he seemed to have gone in the exact opposite direction. For the rest of his life, while he certainly had what we would call crushes on people, in particular somebody like Lydian Emerson or others, it always seemed to be people who were unobtainable. And I don't know if he was really seriously ever interested in a romantic relationship whatsoever. And certainly was not interested in marriage. Certainly by the mid-1850s, when he's about to turn 40 years old, marriage is completely out of the question. So he's not interested in that. I think that he was more interested in a spiritual life. Emerson in his journal would call Emerson my Buddhist Henry or my monk-like Henry. And I think that that's the path that Thoreau took. He was more interested in the spiritual path. And so something like marriage or love or romance was just something that he put behind him. Whether or not it was because the whole Ellen thing was a fiasco and he wanted nothing else to do with it, that it hurt him so much he was just done forever. It's hard to tell. But I think that certainly by the time 1840 rolled around, and certainly by the time he lived at Walden in 1845, he had decided to focus on the solitary life. And he seemed quite happy with that decision.
Yeah. And since you mentioned Lydian, I wanted to bring up something that she had written. So in 1842, both Lydian and Henry had suffered the loss of people that they loved. Henry's brother, John, who had also proposed to that same woman, John died very quickly. Lockjaw. And then a few days later, Lydian lost her son, Waldo. So I wanted to read a quote from a book written by Lydian Emerson's daughter, that Henry had came for a visit right after Waldo died, or right after John died. Henry has been here this evening and seen Mr. Emerson, but no one else. He says John took leave of all the family on Monday with perfect calmness and more than resignation. It is a beautiful fate that has been granted him, and I think he was worthy of it. Here she's talking about John's death. And then she writes about Henry. Henry's just been here. I love him for the feeling he showed and the effort he made to be cheerful. He did not give way in the least, but his whole demeanor was that of one struggling with sickness of heart. I think that one of the main loves in Henry's life was John, and the way that Lydian's describing him, you can tell that as both of them are going through this tremendously emotional time, that there's some kind of bond that develops between them. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a sexual bond, but I would definitely say that emotionally both of them are becoming closer. And there are some letters. So Henry goes to Staten Island at one point to tutor Emerson's nephew, Ralph Waldo Emerson's nephew. And so there are a few letters that exist between him and Lydian. And there's one letter that I was going to read, but it's very flowery, and it seems it doesn't say anything directly sexual. It doesn't say anything directly about how he loves her, but it shows that there's a tremendous amount of feeling towards her. And I think after she gets a letter like that, she responds a little bit more coldly. Right. Also because letters were often read aloud to the entire family because it was kind of an unusual thing back then. So I think it's easy for emotions to get confused, even in letters.
And we know that about the time that John Jr. died, the Emersons' first son, Waldo Jr., died as well, like within a week or two of each other. And I think that the death of those two people really kind of bonded Henry Thoreau and Lydian Emerson. And they shared their grief together, and certainly Ralph Waldo Emerson as well. The deaths of those two people kind of brought Thoreau and the Emerson family closely together. All kinds of rumors and stories, 20th century rumors and stories about Lydian and Henry Thoreau. There is no instance whatsoever that I've been able to find in 20 some years of reading about Henry that there was anything untoward between Lydian Emerson and Henry Thoreau. Did he love her? Yes. Was it a romantic love? Maybe, although in letters he calls her my dear sister. So and she was a lot older than Thoreau. So I really think that in some ways she was like maybe another mother or another older sister more than anything else. So yeah, I think that when it comes to the Lydian Henry stories, let's put the kibosh on that. I've used the word kibosh twice now. Let's put the kibosh on those stories once and for all. So now,
exactly.
Henry did have one more close call when it came to marriage, and it was a woman named Sophia Ford, either spelled F-O-R-D or F-O-O-R-D.
Exactly. So I wanted to talk about how absolutely putting the kibosh on the Lydian piece of it, but Henry was living with the Emersons, sort of as Emerson had asked him to take care of the family while he was away touring in Europe. So there's an easy sense of familiarity that comes when people are that close together. And I'm very glad you brought up Sophia Ford. So she was also in that circle as well. And the story that I've always heard from Thoreauvians was there was this spinster who knew Henry and wrote him a letter proposing marriage to him. And he rejected her completely because he hated the idea of marriage. And, almost how dare he be proposed to by a spinster? There's no way he was going to think of women at all.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So, but I've been doing some digging about her, and it turns out that she had this whole other life even before she came to Concord, and that she was mixed in with this family, with the Emersons and the Alcotts, especially between 1845 and 1847.
Yeah, I think she grew up in Milton, Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken. Born in 1802, so she's around Emerson's age. She's about 15 years older than Henry Thoreau. So she's from the Emerson generation, not the Henry Thoreau generation.
Exactly.
She was a teacher.
Well, she was also, so she was a teacher, but she was involved with the Northampton Association of Education and Industry. There was a utopian community in Florence, Massachusetts, right near Northampton, that was actually the terminus for the northern branch of the Underground Railroad.
Right.
And there's writings that she has, being a part of this community, that area had become quite a depot for fugitives. And she wrote down that the slaves escape so frequently that their masters say the abolitionists must have a railroad underground. So I think it's really great. Yeah. So she was heavily involved in this, and she wasn't a part of Brook Farm. She wasn't a part of Fruitlands, but it turns out that the Alcotts had come to visit Northampton, and that's where Bronson had met her and actually met her and engaged her as a teacher to come and teach his children.
Right.
So she moved in with the Alcotts in 1845, and then in 1846 had sort of started a school in the barn, in Emerson's barn, in Emerson's yard, and was teaching the Emerson children as well.
Right. And so obviously she would have seen Thoreau pretty often, and especially after he moved into the Emerson house in the fall of 1847. So for people that don't know, when Thoreau left Walden Pond in September of 1847, he immediately moved into the Emerson house because Emerson went away to England for a year. So he would have seen Miss Ford he would have seen her daily by that stage. And so Miss Ford fell madly in love with Henry and was convinced that they were soulmates.
Exactly. And this is one of the things where we don't really know what happened at the time. But we do have a quote from Thoreau and this is something that he was writing, and it was published in a week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. If you'll indulge me and let me read this. We don't know if he's referring to Miss Ford or not. He could be talking about Margaret Fuller, but this is one of the only genuine paragraphs we have that really has him talking about a woman. And sort of this is him describing his attitude towards this woman in particular. I know a woman who possesses a restless and intelligent mind, interested in her own culture and earnest to enjoy the highest possible advantages. And I meet her with pleasure as a natural person who not a little provokes me, and I suppose is stimulated in turn by myself. Yet our acquaintance plainly does not attain to that degree of confidence and sentiment which all, in fact, covet. I am glad to help her, as I am helped by her. I like very well to know her with a sort of stranger's privilege, and hesitate to visit her often, like her other friends. My nature pauses here. I do not well know why. Perhaps she does not make the highest demand on me, a religious demand. Some with whose prejudices or peculiar bias I have no sympathy, yet inspire me with confidence. And I trust that they confide in me also as a religious heathen, at least.
Right. So, that could be Margaret Fuller. It could be Miss Ford. We just don't know. So
exactly, it could be a combination, but I think it's interesting that he's recognizing that there's a woman in his circle of people, that she wants something. He doesn't quite realize that he realizes that he's not a person to satisfy that.
yeah, it's really interesting because Henry grew up in a family of women. I mean, he had his mom, he had his two sisters, he had various aunts who were living with him off and on, or living with them off and on. He was constantly surrounded by brilliant women from his family, Lydian Emerson, the Alcotts. But from what we understand, when he was younger, he was really awkward around women. There's a great quote that says that he could never enter a room filled with women without getting embarrassed. So he was just kind of this awkward kid for many, many years. So it's 1847, 1848. He's living at the Emerson house. Miss Ford proposes marriage to him. Yeah. And so he wrote a letter to Emerson, and it's a really long letter, but there's one paragraph where he says, I have had a tragic correspondence, for the most part all on one side, with Miss Ford. She did really wish to, I hesitate to write, marry me. That is the way they spell it. Of course, I did not write a deliberate answer. How could I deliberate upon it? I sent back as distinct a no as I have learned to pronounce after considerable practice, and I trust that this no has succeeded. So I guess she must have proposed to him by letter.
Yes. Does that sound familiar at all?
Indeed, I wish that it might burst like a hollow shot after it had struck and buried itself and made itself felt there. There was no other way. I really had anticipated no such foe as this in my career. So Henry was pretty mortified. Eventually, she left Concord not too long after that, like by 1848, 49, she left Concord. But she was convinced that they were soulmates, and she was convinced that they should be together. And she continued to write him letters for quite a while after she left Concord. But in fact, she even threatened, sadly, at one time, she said that if Henry didn't marry her, she was going to kill herself, which of course she didn't do. She lived until, I think, 1885. And
Louisa May Alcott writes her a really lovely obituary for her.
Right. So
they had stayed in touch.
And which always makes me wonder, did the Alcotts, did they all know about this thing going on between Henry and Miss Ford? I'm sure it was out there. But eventually Henry wouldn't even read her letters. He would just burn them without even opening them. Basically, Henry ghosted her, as we would say nowadays.
It's so heartbreaking, though.
It is heartbreaking, and it's funny because Thoreauvians tend to laugh this whole episode off, just like, oh, ha, 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 that Henry. But, we've all been rejected and at one time or another. And I really feel badly for Sophia Ford in the midst of all of this, because here's somebody, she's convinced they're soulmates. Henry ghosts her, and she never hears from him ever again. It was Louisa Alcott, I think, who contacted Miss Ford in 1862 and told her that Thoreau had died.
Yeah.
But she was also convinced that they would see each other in the afterlife. But then she never married at all. From what we understand, remained faithful to Henry for the rest of her life. And like we said, she died in 1885. She was 83 when she died. So she lived a pretty good life.
Well, and also as a teacher, Louisa has lots of happy remembrances of her, including like running across Flint's Pond, which is what's called Sandy Pond now. She just took her class out, and it sounds a lot like the types of classes that Henry taught, where he just takes the kids out and they just explore nature.
Well, the fact that she was hired by Bronson Alcott to be a teacher, she must have been pretty progressive in her educational ways for
Yeah.
him to want her to come to Concord and teach his children. So she was obviously an educational reformer. She was obviously a spiritualist of some sort. Um, there basically everything that you and I have said about Miss Ford is really all that we know about her. There's really not that much. We don't even have any photographs of her or images of her. The few images that we know, or the descriptions of her, are not very flattering. And so I don't like to repeat any of those, but it just seems like here's a
but she also has like a life as an abolitionist,
right.
So she's her own person, even though there's not a lot of documentation.
She's an incredibly progressive, from what we know, a progressive, intelligent, free-thinking, for lack of a better term, 21st century woman in so many ways. Women don't propose to men in the 19th century. It's just not done.
Right.
But Miss Ford did it, much to Henry's mortification.
Exactly.
So those are the two moments of Henry coming dangerously close to being married. He was turned down once, and he turned somebody down. So poor Henry was 0 for 2 when it came to marriage proposals.
Exactly. And also I wanted to bring up Walter Harding, because he has an essay on Thoreau's sexuality. And it came out in the early 90s, and I think, he uses a lot of the writings of Thoreau to sort of suggest that Thoreau might have been homosexual,
right?
Or he might have been gay. One of the quotes that you can sort of interpret any which way: "I love men with the same distinctions that I love women, as if my friend were of some third sex, some other or stranger, and still my friend." So,
right. Again, just like there's no information as to whether or not Henry was straight, there's really no information as to whether or not he was gay. And Tammy, you and I have talked about this before. I tend to think that Henry is what we would call asexual. He's not a prude. He was born on a farm. He had two sisters and a brother, and his parents had a very strong marriage. So he's no prude, but he's just not really interested in sex. Romance, great. He would love romance. When his friend Harrison Blake was getting married, he asked Thoreau for advice, and Henry sent him an essay on chastity. And he said that marriage should be a union between two souls. It should be a marriage of the intellect and a marriage of the soul. And that's where a man and woman should connect, intellectually and spiritually. And sex basically just kind of ruins the union of two perfect souls.
Yeah.
And so I think that essay that he wrote, it's called Chastity and Sensuality. It really kind of lays out Thoreau's ideas about what he thought about sex and what he thought about marriage. And he's bringing it up to marriage up to a spiritual and intellectual level.
Right. And as you mentioned, like Whitman, right? Like Thoreau has written about Whitman. So he's acknowledging what sex is and how Whitman is describing it. And Whitman's very graphic and very forward, especially for his time. But Thoreau kind of goes in the other way. Exactly what you're talking about. All the spiritualism.
He says it's too sensual, but the reason it's too sensual is because people are not pure enough to understand it.
Right. He's not a prude. He's aware of it.
Right. Which is such transcendental logic. Whitman was writing dirty things, but if you were pure, you would understand what he's talking about. He's not writing it because he's dirty. He's writing it because he's pure, which is so transcendental. But again, that kind of gives you an idea as to what Thoreau's ideals were when it came to love and marriage and sexuality.
Exactly. And also we can sort of end on the joke about the mushroom that he found, that, looked, I think it's called a phallus, an impudent phallus in Latin. That's how it gets translated.
Right, and it looks like a phallus. And Henry drew a picture of it in his journal. And he was basically appalled. He thought it was disgusting and appalling, and he said that it put nature on the level of someone who writes on the walls of privies. so he's kind of a prude when it comes to the phallic looking mushroom. But other than that, I think he had a transcendental view of love and marriage. And you just have to kind of read between the lines. And if you read his letter to Blake, where he has the essay about chastity, I think that gives a pretty good idea as to what Henry thought about relationships between men and women, or same-sex relationships as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. This has been a lot of fun talking to you.
This has been a blast. I guess I should say that if anybody's really interested in learning more about these people, there's a really great tour company in Concord called, oddly enough, the Concord Tour Company. And they give a really wonderful tour called No Remedy for Love. And it's about the love lives of all of the Concord authors, and some other people that aren't really that well known. And it's a great little tour. So ConcordTourCompany.org, I believe, is their website, or you can just Google Concord Tour Company, and you could go on a tour and find out more about these people and their love life, or their lack of love life in some instances.
Awesome. I can highly recommend them. I've been on many of their tours, and they're absolutely amazing. And I believe I'm talking to one of their tour guides right now.
I think you are, yes.
Yeah. So cool. And I also wanted to just give a shout out to Many Moons and Marjorie Merritt Carmen for helping to make this conversation happen. Thank you all.
And thank you to the folks at Minuteman.
Yes, Minuteman Network. Thank you very much. Minuteman Media Network. Thank you all. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, everybody.